I was going to start off by asking Peter to reflect a bit, if you like, on the essay question, from milk snatching to maths, how has education in England changed? I think it's the thing that's remarkable about Peter's book, and the thing that sticks with me is a thing that I think is always underestimated in conversations about education in England, which is just how new everything is. There's often, when we're doing things and when we're taking on topics and tasks, there are very often, we underestimate the extent to which we are dealing with problems for the very first time. Or we used to get away with things by just letting children fail in a way that we sort of don't really do now. Peter, I was wondering if I could get you to start off by just talking us through for, say, 10 minutes, what our participants need to know. I should also say, by the way, if you put in questions into the chat, I will throw them to the panelists later on.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks very much to ARK for putting together this panel. I'm actually looking forward very much to hearing from Sam and Leora in particular, because, look, I'm an historian and I'm not laser focused on education policy, still less on education policy today. I've got a lot to learn from people who are focused in the way that Sam and Leora and indeed Chris are. But I also think as an historian that, and actually just for good intellectual reasons, regardless of discipline, sometimes it is useful to step back and think about the longer term, because it reveals dimensions of the problems that we're grappling with, which aren't revealed by the way in which policy analysis in particular tends to focus on very short periods, usually within the span of the current government, and is determined to find little upticks of the data in one category or another, and then determined to attribute them or not to the recent government policy on which they're fixated. And while not denying, and I wouldn't want to deny in the presence of practitioners, as you say, Chris, while not denying that policy does matter in some ways, I also think that there are these powerful social and cultural and demographic forces that sometimes very much more powerful than politicians or indeed the electorate realize, that you can only view if you step back. So in the book, I'll just give a few examples of how I think this works, and then I'll try to, over the long term, and then I'll try to say something more specifically about the essay question about the last few decades. So for example, we all know that there was a move away from the 11 plus and the breakdown of what's sometimes called the tripartite system, where kids are sorted at 11 and 13 into two or three different kinds of schools. We all know there was a breakdown of that system. It's usually attributed to a particular circular that Tony Crossland issued from the Department of Education and Science in 1965. And in the book, I try to show how that circular made almost no difference, that the moved away from the 11 plus and the breaking down of the sorting into different types of schools was already well underway before Tony Crossland even took office. It wasn't even really substantially accelerated by what he did with that single circular. And what lay behind the breakdown of the 11 plus was the incredible demand among parents and students to take a grammar school exam, the O level in England and Wales. And they started demanding it and actually taking it in secondary modern schools and all sorts of other places that they shouldn't have been taking it in, not just grammar schools. And so by the time Crossland comes into power, the 11 plus is already largely a dead letter in most local authorities around the country. Similarly, if we think about the rapid growth of higher education in the 1960s, it's often attributed to the Robbins report that Lionel Robbins promulgated in 1963. But again, as a knock-on effect of that parental demand to take O levels and therefore thereafter A levels, there was already a dramatic growth in eligibility for higher education before Robbins put pen to paper. And in fact, the point of the Robbins report was simply to give the government, at the time a Tory government, an excuse to adopt a policy which it had been traditionally rather shy of, rapid expansion of higher education, because it was already happening, and it would be better to embrace it and indeed claim credit for it if you could than to try to resist it. And then finally, bringing us up to the present, for 50 years between the 1960s and the 2000s, governments of all stripes tried to persuade young people to do science subjects, what we now call STEM subjects, in school and university, and yet between the early 60s and the late 2000s, the proportion of people doing STEM subjects at school and university dropped. In university, the proportion dropped from about 57% in the early 60s to 38% in the late 2000s. So, nothing that governments did, and they repeatedly tried to engineer a shift, a swing to science, as they described it. And what they got was a swing away from science for all sorts of complicated social and cultural and demographic reasons, largely having to do with the expansion of the system. The people coming into the system didn't want to, weren't equipped to do science subjects, and they did traditional arts and humanities subjects, or increasingly new kinds of subjects that we call social studies. So I think in all of those cases, politicians sometimes got out of the way, sometimes claimed credit, but they were almost always just trailing after these powerful social and cultural and demographic forces that they had little direct control over. Now, what about our brief, which is to consider the recent decades? And I suppose implicit, at least, is a suggestion that a new era opened in the 1980s. It's easy, of course, for an historian to fall back on it's too soon to tell. We're still saying that about the French Revolution. It probably is too soon to tell about the effects of some of the policies, certainly of the last 10 or 20 years. I have to say, personally, I'm not terribly impressed by the things that impress a lot of people about the policies of the 80s, local management of schools, academization, MATs, I'm afraid, parental choice, accountability measures. I spoke some years ago at a meeting of senior civil servants of the DFE where Alison Wolf and Michael Barber and I were all supposed to talk about the impact of the Butler Act. And we were asked by the permanent secretary, what's the biggest change in education policy of the last few years that we'll be talking about 70 years from now? And all the civil servants in the room said, oh, accountability measures, that's the revolutionary. And I said GCSEs for reasons that I'll explain in a second. And they all looked very puzzled indeed. It struck me as really rather tragic that they hadn't realized how important GCSE was and what a great achievement I think GCSEs were for their own policies and also for the prospects of young people in this country. Happily, in the Twitter chat surrounding this event over the last few days, Chris and I both proposed GCSE as the most important reform of the last 40 years. In my view, GCSE did more than any previous reform, including comprehensive reorganization, to break down this historic bipartite divide between academic and non-academic children that tended to especially separate the sheep from the goats, not at 11, but at 16. Because GCSE, I mean, of course, when GCSE was brought in, you could still leave school at 16, but everyone at least left with a credential which could be used and was used by increasing numbers to access advanced further education and higher education thereafter. And what it did is it opened the door for these forces of demand that I talk about in the book to start manifesting themselves in the growth of higher education on a much larger scale, obviously in the 90s and 80s than was ever even conceivable in the 60s. Now, as Sam pointed out in another Twitter chat in the last few days, I think rather mischievously, though correctly, there is still a divide at 16, and it's still the case that most adolescents leave school at 16 and stop academic study. But nevertheless, the proportion of the cohort of 16 to 19-year-olds that achieved some level 3 qualification has continued to climb, or at least it climbed quite rapidly in the first decade of this century, from about 40% to 60%. It's kind of leveled off in the last few years. And actually I'm not sure that enough attention has been paid to that. Of those 60% who are taking level 3 qualifications, it's true that only 40%, that is 2/3 of them, are taking A levels. This was Sam's point. And an academic, often school-based qualification. The other 20% mostly taking BTECs, and they're often seen as vocational, although I'm not sure that that's entirely right, and they're often through FE colleges, so they're not academic qualifications in the school. And nevertheless, the effect of the combination of the A level and the BTEC has been to blur that divide at 16 between academic and non-academic children, and to give more 18-year-olds access to higher education, so that we have, over almost about 50% of the age cohort going into higher education now, mostly with A levels, some of them only with BTECs, and some of them, interestingly, with a combination of A levels and BTECs, which I think shows that you can blur this divide, even while maintaining separate qualifications. So for all the talk about T levels and parity of esteem, I do think between them, GCSE and BTECs, and some other applied general qualifications, have really made a big difference in opening up educational opportunity, in raising the general educational level of this country, and to some extent challenging traditional hierarchies, although there's only a limit to what education can do, and that's still obviously a long-term work in progress. So I'll leave it there, and I'm very looking forward to hearing what Leora and Sam have to say.
Thanks ever so much, Peter. I think we'll go to Sam next, if that's all right.
Great, thanks, Chris. And thanks, Peter. And just before I say anything else, I would want to endorse Chris's recommendation that you read Peter's book. I've been reading a lot of history of education books for my own project recently, and Peter's is the best I've read. I mean, it is really superb, and I think benefits from being written by a historian, perhaps rather than someone from within the sector, someone who's got a real sort of unbiased perspective on what's happened. And it's pretty sobering for someone who's been involved in policy for a long time to be correctly sort of told that policymakers have a fairly limited impact. Really, what really matters in a society is the big economic, social, demographic shifts. And in a way, you can almost see the whole history of English education as being the elite slowly loosening their grip on access to each layer of education. You go sort of primary in the end of the 19th century, secondary in the sort of post-war era, 16 to 19, and then university more recently. And I think for me, the big question that Peter's book left with me is what's next? How do we keep this going? How do we keep this sort of process of letting go of elite control of access? Because I think that the demand is still absolutely there. Those demographic pressures, those sort of parental pressures are still there. You know, you look at surveys of parents, and 90% plus want their children to go to university when they're young children. So I think there's still potential here. And before I read the book, I'd have probably said that local management for schools was the most important policy innovation of the last 40 years. I probably think it's more important than Peter, but actually having read it and having sort of thought about it subsequently, I think GCSEs is the right answer. And I think a lot of people don't appreciate how important GCSEs were to opening up the education system. It was a very small number of, it was a minority percentage of young people who did any education post 16 before GCSEs came in, and that unlocked education, sort of the next step of education for a huge number of young people. And it's one of the reasons I get so nervous when I hear people now say, oh, we don't need GCSEs, they've served their purpose, we've got education to 18, we can scrap them, we can go to some kind of 14 to 19 system which starts separating people out into vocational and academic. Again, I worry you could lose a lot of the benefits, even though obviously there are issues with GCSEs. There are things that could be done to improve them, but if you try to radically change that part of the system, you could find yourselves going backwards. But the bit I wanted to talk about, so what's next, is this 16 to 19. And I do think, on reflection, that bit of our system is pretty outdated. I think it's pretty restrictive and exclusionary. And we never really have the discussion about how to open it up. We just sort of accept the specialization of A levels as being a good thing, an English thing, something we've always done, without thinking about the consequences that it has for the wider system. What it means is that we're kind of stuck with only 40% of children being able to do A levels, and that figure hasn't really changed for quite a while now, and that's likely to always be the case unless we consider significant change post 16, just because they're very hard. It's very hard to do A-level maths because it's such a big part of your curriculum time. Whereas if you look at most countries, they will do a much broader range of subjects, 16 to 19, and that does mean that there's much more space for more young people to access that education. The other benefit of that is that you get a wider range of subjects being taken to a later point. I think we're one of the very few countries where maths is only compulsory to 16, where speaking your own language or studying your own language is only compulsory to 16. And I think that causes a lot of problems for for people in terms of their ability to engage in society, work, etc. beyond 18, and I think almost we're going in the wrong way with 16 to 19 at the moment. There's a trend for more selective schools post 16. There's always been some element of selection post 16. There's no real admissions code post 16, and there probably needs to be some element of selection, but the extent of selection is growing, and we're getting boroughs now, particularly in London, but also elsewhere, where a lot of the schools are quite selective, and that's starting to get quite exclusionary again, and perhaps starting to lose some of the benefits we gained from having a GCSE qualification that opened up that space to more young people. So I guess my challenge to everyone listening is how do we start having this conversation? How do we have this conversation about what's next? How do we unlock the next section of education for more young people, rather than constantly think about how can we ration it in a more efficient or effective way?
Thanks ever so much, Sam. Leora, can I ask you to follow on?
So thank you so much. And just to say, I absolutely love both what Peter and Sam have given us, the analysis of the importance of GCSEs from somebody who wasn't born in England. I can absolutely vouch for the desirability of GCSEs as a qualification. And I think in England, we sort of forget that almost at our peril, in fact. So, and I love this notion that Sam described of the importance of opening up education to more young people. So I want to approach that through a slightly different lens. So one might say that the lens that I'm going to look at is structural reform, but actually I want to conclude by making the case that this is not about structural reform. This is about how you use the power of the group, the power of structures to improve the quality of education. In other words, to open up education for young people. So I want to argue for, I suppose, 3 stages of education reform with a prequel in the Thatcher years. So I think Margaret Thatcher's premiership saw a profound change in the ecology of education. So I think once governments accepted that the experts, largely local education authority officers, and by the way, I was one of those, I was a director of education for many years, knew best and could be trusted to act not only in children's and parents' interests, but also for the wider social and national good. And the government's role was to provide sufficient resources, subject to those big economic constraints that Sam mentioned and competing budgetary demands. So I think Thatcher was the first prime minister to attempt to disrupt the so-called grip of the local authority with the introduction of grant-maintained status. So new schools, the city technology colleges were set up. But in fact, fewer than 1,000 of the 24,000 schools became grant-maintained, and only around 15 CTCs were opened, and at a much higher cost than the Treasury intended. So that's the prequel bit. Stage 1, I think, of the reform journey I want to talk about is the Blair years. So the first city academies were established in 2000 by the Blair government to drive up standards by replacing failing schools in struggling local authorities, mostly in urban conurbations. Originally called city academies, the Labour government dropped the word city to allow for academies in struggling rural areas as well as inner cities. So these early academies were a failure response. Blair wanted to bring in corporate and commercial sponsors into failing schools as a way to improve them. So what we saw in that first stage of reform was, I think, a failure response. Stage 2 of the reform journey, I would broadly call the Gove years and the Gove legacy. So that's around 2010 to now. So with the election of a coalition government in 2010, we saw the Academies Act give rise to large-scale conversions of schools and the proliferation of groups of schools in multi-academy trusts. So in 2010, just 202 of the 24,000 schools were academies. Gove turned the failure response on its head and returned arguably to Thatcher's policy of freedom of schools from local authority control as a positive decision. So in August this year, we see just short of 10,000 schools are academy schools, and more than half of children and young people in England are educated in school trusts. But I would agree with the point that 10 years is a very, very short time in public policy. So stage 3, I think for me, stage 3 is 2021 and beyond. And the Confederation of School Trusts very much believes that we can't limp on indefinitely with a two-tier system, particularly one in which leaves smaller maintained schools vulnerable as local authorities, through no fault of their own, by the way, retract their school improvement services. So it is imperative, I think, now that we create system coherence and we build robust knowledge building structures focused exclusively on the quality of education. It's taken a 10-year horizon for this change to happen, for us to get to more than half of children and young people educated in the sector. If we take the beginning of the journey as the 2010 Academies legislation. So I reckon to complete the reform journey is likely to take another 10 years. Therefore, the time horizon we're proposing to complete the reform journey is around 2030. So let me say what I think a school trust is. A school trust is an education charity. It's not a private provider. There are no shareholders, no dividends. The trust cannot make a profit. It has a single legal and moral purpose: to advance education for public benefit. It recognizes in its articles that idea that education is a public good. The structure itself is not a panacea. The important thing that the trust creates is the conditions for deep and purposeful collaboration among teachers and leaders to do the things that matter to children, to create positive education outcomes for children. So we as CST believes that trusts are knowledge building structures that can do school improvement at scale. And by turning around some of the schools that have not been good enough, sometimes in the history of state education. So for example, we've just seen North Shore Academy not being good in its history, get a fantastic result in its Ofsted inspection under the executive leadership and strong governance of the Northern Education Trust. So I think the structure of the trust creates, and particularly ARK, creates the vehicle for improving the quality of education by focusing on things that matter most: strong curricula and assessment, high standards of behaviour, secure knowledge of how to improve schools. These are the things that I think matter to parents and communities. And this is the conversation I think that will move us forward. But it's also important to understand that school trusts are a new form of civic structure. So we need to galvanize trusts as good civic partners, working with other civic actors to advance education as a public good in their locality. So for me, trust leaders are civic leaders. As well as leading a group of schools to give children a better future, trust leaders look beyond their organization. They seek to work with other civic actors to ensure the value of the child, and that the collective actions of all civic actors protect and promote high quality education. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Leora. I have a lot of questions for you. I was wondering if I could come back to Peter and just say, I think there are two things that strike me from listening to those two reflections. So first from Sam, I wonder if I wonder if what you make of Sam's sort of view about whether we should see, I think I'm fairly reflecting you, Sam, but see sort of the next stage in the process as being moving the way forward into 16 to 18. But also one of the things I think is really interesting that underpins actually like the end of your reflection, Peter, as well on the GCSE, is the sense that I feel like sometimes we struggle with as a country, and it may help that you're not natively from you've not had the pain of going through the O level yourself.
I have 2 O levels. Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry, my apologies.
Two.
But the extent to which our reflections on our education system are shaped by the assumption that the O level is the predecessor to the GCSE, rather than being something radical and different that changed it. And the extent to which people with a sort of grammar school or public school background assume that the education system we have is as it always was, and a sort of a lack of understanding of the rolling revolution.
Yeah, that last one is a very good point. And I do think that some of the reason for the underappreciation of the GCSE is that, as you were just suggesting, some people just think it's the continuation of the O level, and therefore there's nothing to see there. But other people think of it as some kind of dumbed down O level without any positive consequences, and it has not enough champions. I agree with a lot of what Sam said. I certainly agree that we need to work on 16 to 19. I think some of what I was trying to say was aimed at that, though perhaps not as targeted as Sam's suggestions. So for example, I am very worried by the growing selectivity at 16 to 19 that Sam pointed to. I mean, my children went to 11 to 16 comprehensives in Cambridge because that's the form of mostly the form of school organization here. And then they went to a sixth form college. And
was it Hills Road, Peter?
I was just going to say, they went to the famous Hills Road. And when I tell people this, they say, oh, well, of course, Hills Road, But actually, entry to Hills Road requires Bs at GCSE, whereas entry to a lot of the sort of top London academies, where they have separate 11 and 16 admissions procedures, you need A's and A stars. So that's a novelty, and I think that's a really, really retrograde step, because as Sam says, not only is that recreating a hierarchy, it's just pushing it forward from 11 to 16, but it's also actually creating, hothouse schools, which I don't think are good for anyone, and depriving other 16 to 19-year-olds of a great opportunity. So the question is, well, how can you provide this warm and welcoming and inviting atmosphere at 16 to 19 where everyone thrives? I mean, there are a lot of different models. I mean, some people would like to champion 11 to 18 comprehensives, and some people do think that if you had something that was somewhere in between a sixth form college and a further education college, which is actually what Hills Road is in some ways, that might serve the purpose as well. I'm a little bit dubious about the specialization or the anti-specialization case, because I'm just too aware of the cognitive gains that specialization does produce. And I'm also aware of the way in which specialization allows kids to go at 16 into subjects that they know they love, that they know they're good at, and thrive there, and doesn't require them to, in the name of a sort of broad spectrum, to take subjects where they're not so happy. And I mean, I don't think there's any correlation internationally between late specialization and widening participation. I don't think there's any evidence that late specialization, generally speaking, equips more kids for higher education.
So Peter, one of our guests has asked, how important do we think the single subject sort of English degree style, 3 or 4 years, has been in keeping this model in place? Yeah, well,
I mean, it's true, it does, and again, I don't want to defend something just because it's something that I've benefited from, and but as I say, I do think that there are cognitive gains to be gleaned because kids are specializing things they like, both at 16 to 19 and at university. And also, we know actually that in the current labor market, 80% of graduate jobs are not aimed at particular subjects. The employers want, enthusiastic, trainable, well-socialized, thoughtful people who are capable of higher analytical qualities. And I think specialist education at 16 to 19 does that. The question is, as Sam raised, and I can't really answer, is whether it, certainly in its current configuration, it's not allowing enough kids to thrive at 16 to 19. It's one reason why I stress people who are taking A-levels and BTECs, because that shows that actually if you blur those distinctions, you can bring more kids into the system. But I'm certainly agree that that's one of the big questions for the next period.
I mean, one of the bees in my bonnet is my hunch that if you introduce any differentiation into English education, so as soon as if you were to bring in a more generalized degree, an American style liberal degree, if it were not the style of degree being offered at a handful of very old British universities, it would be seen as a lower class degree and therefore would basically fail. I'm quite suspicious of our ability to overcome the prejudices, basically, of the British people about wanting an old-fashioned education. Is that, I mean, as someone who's thought about this over a century, not that you've spent a century thinking about it, that, looking over the last century, do you think that's a fair?
I think people, they want the best education they can get. And so, yes, they tend to associate that with the one favored by elites. But actually, if you look at what's happened over the last 60 years, the range of subjects that people study is widened quite considerably. And in the 60s and 70s, when the swing away from science started, people were leaping in very large numbers into subjects like psychology and communications. And then, of course, we brought creative arts into the higher education system. And although they've, of course, they have been stratified too, right? So everyone is now very determined to make creative arts be the sort of dumb subject that only kids from the poor schools do. Generally speaking, I think some of the new subjects have really thrived. So it's not impossible to shake up that traditional hierarchy. And the Higher Education Policy Institute just came out with a report about the crisis of the humanities, which I thought was doing just that. It was reinforcing the old hierarchy. Oh, look, people aren't doing history and English and classics. Disaster. But my response to that was, no, they're doing lots of different and new things, and that's to be celebrated, not to be complained of. So that's a sign, I think, that actually in their behaviors, British people have been able to forge new across new frontiers without undue deference to the traditional hierarchies.
Can I take up a thought from Leora, and then I'll try and encourage Leora and Sam to slide into you two-footedly themselves. One of the things, I think you have to forgive me if I'm mischaracterizing you, Leora, but I think Leora talks about wanting a simplification effectively of the existing multi-part sort of structure, and moving towards a sort of, I think, a flatter hierarchy of schools, a sort of simplified legal form for schooling. There's one of the things that comes through your book is the importance of the local authority as an intermediary partly as a sort of brutal administrator, but also as a sort of agent of local politics. And one of the things I think we still haven't figured out in this new configuration is how we make MATs and academies and local accountability work. So you don't have to believe either that the Doncaster Council did a good job of running at schools, which I think no one does, nor do you have to believe that it's a bit worrying that it's not clear that how a Doncaster parent exercises their democratic capability to challenge a local head. And I just wonder what your thoughts are on that tension.
Are you asking me, or you asking?
Oh, sorry, Peter. I thought with the historical, I was interested in whether you. And what you thought because it sort of it makes me feel like we've taken a wedge out of the system that's been very important in shaping it over the last 100 years.
I mean, I'm sorry, I'm going to give you an anecdote, which isn't really very helpful, but I mean, we still don't really know what the transmission mechanisms were for these parental pressures. I mean, yes, local authorities were inevitably and the intermediary, because they were the the agency that decided what the provision of education locally would be. But I was in the North Yorkshire Record Office this summer, and I was reading the papers of a secondary modern school in North Yorkshire in the early 60s. And the headmaster was a very traditional head who thought that secondary moderns should be, Victorian culture factories, and they should, bring up well-behaved young working class boys and girls who would go into the labor market and not worry their little heads about the higher things, but that they would get a good, well-rounded education in life and also learn something of the arts and so on. And his roles were dropping in the early 60s. And every speech day, he would get up and say, why don't people want to come to this school? Why don't people want to come to the school? And finally, he actually says in the 64 speech day, he says, some parents have been coming to me and saying, why don't you offer O-levels? He said, I don't offer O-levels because that's not what secondary moderns should be doing. Secondary moderns should be building good citizens and well-behaved Christian boys and girls. And they were saying, but the parents were saying, yeah, but there's a comprehensive school down the road in Settle, and actually we'd rather go there and take O-levels. And then the next year he gets replaced. North Yorkshire goes comprehensive, and the school starts to grow again. So it's not really clear that intermediaries matter as much as in that case, parents just voting with their feet. And I'm a little bit agnostic, I have to say, about this. I do think there has to be a local or some kind of intermediary body organizing education. I would like to see it on a geographical basis, but most MATs, which are quite small, are mostly in clusters of schools right close to each other. So they actually serve the function, not so much of the old local authorities as kind of mini local authorities. And I think they're simply just, replacing functions that local authorities used to fulfill, albeit on a less democratic basis. And I don't know what the ideal way to organize things is, but I hear what Leora is saying. And the London Challenge was an incredible experiment in collaboration across schools on a much larger scale than any MAT, and it did quite a good job, I think, in raising standards across the metropolis.
So, Leora, do you think that's I published a story this week in which we published some data on the number of people who get 3Ds or equivalent by parliamentary constituency, and it's about 22% at the lowest in Nottinghamshire. And I'm struck by this the interplay of there still being extreme geographical inequality in education, extreme geographical variation, I should say, in education, plus the fact that we need some kind of accountability. You can't, writing to the Secretary of State feels like it's the wrong level of government to be dealing with. And I struggle to work out how we make these things mesh together while not leaving places to local authorities that are just bad.
So I think that's a complex question, and we could spend an hour just discussing that. I'll try to be brief in my answer. I think I agree with you that I don't think there's more work for us to do to define the role of local government in terms of democratic oversight of the local education system. I do agree with you on that. I don't think that means that trusts are not democratically accountable. I think they are democratically accountable. But I would agree that in relation to local democracy, that we probably need to do a bit more work. I don't believe that means that local government needs to maintain schools. In part for this reason, local government doesn't maintain GP surgeries. Now, we wouldn't think that was a good idea. I don't think the public would think it was a good idea for local government to maintain GP surgeries. And why would we not? Why would we instinctively not think that was a good idea? Because GP surgeries are specialist organizations that require specialist clinical governance. Now, I think you can make a parallel there with education. I don't think there's anything wrong. In fact, I think it's sensible education policy to set up organizations that are specialist organizations that really know how to improve schools, requiring specialist governance to run schools. Part of the work that we're doing about the positioning of school trusts as civic structures is to recalibrate that relationship with local government. So in the maintained system, there's a bit of a dependency relationship between local government and the schools that it maintains. In a system that I think we're moving towards, I think the relationship is much more like other civic institutions. So like universities, like FE colleges, for example, in the relationship they have with local government. And I think that's fine. I think that's a good adult to adult relationship, but it does require us to recognize that we must be good civic partners, and we must be partners in place, as place is fundamentally important. And I would agree with Peter's point that, you know, more than 80% of trusts in the country are 5 schools or fewer. Many of them are, in fact, you know, geographically proximate and in a place. And therefore that notion of the trust as an anchor institution in place, and of a good relationship with a range of civic partners, including local government, feels to me like the way that we can recalibrate that relationship in a meaningful way. I could say more on this, Chris, but I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you ever so much. Sam, we have a few comments in the chat. I just wonder if I could throw a couple at you at once. So one was, Tom Rose asks about, no one's mentioned T-levels. I'd be interested in your thoughts, actually, and Peter's thoughts. I think my general supposition is that T-level will be precisely as successful as the GMVQ, but I may be overly pessimistic. I'd also point out, David Hoare asks about whether we should be thinking more about early years. And on, sorry, I spotted one as well. Do we need to also think about pre-16 education, and like is moving on to 16 to 19, if you like, premature when we still have large gaps? Kate Chatwell also asks whether norm referencing is effectively a break if it condemns a large number to failure. So there's a few questions for you there.
A few fairly big issues.
They're related. They're related.
I can do. I mean, T-levels, I won't claim to be an expert. I haven't been following it closely. My fear would be that, similar to yours, Chris, that when you start creating new names for things that aren't A-levels, it's that will be a big barrier to take up, because A-levels is still what is associated with being the
I mean, I think we published a thing on it this week, actually. For what it is worth, my general view is, if the government regards success as T-levels stopping children from going to university, and as soon as children work out that taking T-levels means you can't go to university, no one will take T-levels. So they're going to be stuck between, they will eventually, I suspect, start making it easier to turn T-levels into a university entry course, at which point they will cease to have any value whatsoever to anyone, and everyone will take BTECs.
I mean, my instinct, going back to this specialization point, is making A-levels more inclusive is the way to go. And I think that, you know, we could have a whole long conversation about that, which I won't get into. But I think that's what I'm interested in, is how you can't do exactly what you did with GCSEs for the 16 to 19 group. But I'm interested in what we could do to do something similar. On the early years point, I have fairly heretical views about early years. I actually think it's incredibly important to fully fund early years. We should. I'm kind of surprised Labour haven't just announced that they would fully fund 2 to 4 year olds. There are all sorts of extremely good economic labour market reasons for doing that. But when it comes to education, I think that it's probably overstated the importance of early years. Yes, it can add value, but there is a limit to what a 3-year-old or 4-year-old can do or know. And if you don't then have extremely good primary and secondary school, you'll just fade out and lose all of the benefits you get from anything you do in early years. So whilst I would, for lots of reasons, invest more in early years, I don't actually think that's going to do a huge amount of gap closing unless you also do all the right things through the rest of the system. Kate's point on norm referencing, of course, I do have to, it isn't quite norm referencing. The comparable outcomes is, it is now we have
it's rationed numbers of grades rather than norm reference numbers of grades.
It does try to keep what it does is it prevents inflation in a very strict way. Although there are ways to show that standards are genuinely improving and for grades to go up. So it's not quite norm referencing. I think it's quite. I mean, if you don't have it, then you have to go back to criterion referencing, and then you have to accept inflation, and maybe that's fine. But it did get pretty. The risk is it starts to devalue the system, and people stop taking it seriously, like inflation in any system. So I am nervous about abandoning it, but I'm very open to finding ways. And I think Ofqual are actually looking at this, to be fair to them, finding ways to be a bit more expansive and thoughtful about accepting evidence that standards have improved, rather than making it feel quite like it is norm referencing. I mean, you can't have if you have an assessment where everyone gets the same grade, then it doesn't really have much value as an assessment. So there has to be differentiation, but we could be more thoughtful about how we do that.
That's very good. Okay, excellent. Peter, I wonder if I could come back to you. Rob Bristow, who I assume is Rob Bristow of Pearson Education, asks about is the appetite for education insatiable? What does that mean? Not just for 16 to 19, but adult education and lifelong learning. I think one of the things that's striking from your book is that I can't think of any point over the last 100 years where we've underestimated demand for education, but I can think of a lot of times when we were caught out on the other way round.
You mean the other? You've just reversed it. There's never been a point when we overestimated. We always underestimated.
Yes, we've consistently been caught out by more people wanting education, and particularly academic education.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, again, I'm an historian. I'm not really very good at telling at fortune telling. Although the people who claim to be good at fortune telling aren't very good at it either. So at least we're on a level of equal ignorance. Except that I know I'm ignorant and they don't. But yes, I mean every decade. All the experts have confidently said not only do only 5% or 10% or 15% or 20% of the age cohort are they capable of tackling higher education, but only those percentages would actually want it, and we've always been wrong-footed. But I mean, there presumably has to be some upper limit. Korea has something like 70 to 80% now higher education participation. And, we're always being told we want to emulate Korea in so many ways. I'm not sure why this is the one way we shouldn't emulate Korea. I think the problem we've got at present is that for reasons that I sort of understand, I guess it was Sam may have had a hand in it. 10 years ago, faced with an austerity policy that they had to work within, the educational policy boffins in government decided the only way to pay for higher education was to establish a student loan scheme which paid back based on graduate earnings. And now that we're stuck in that system, the whole policy apparatus is obsessed with either reducing the number of people in higher education in order to reduce the hit that the state takes, or to pretend that by steering people into high productivity sectors, somehow everyone will start paying back their student loans. Of course, the other way of doing it is what they're trying to do right now, which is to lower the threshold so that you start paying back your student loan if you're on the minimum wage. I'm being sarcastic. I mean, so we're stuck in a kind of policy trap now where every department of government, from the Treasury on downwards, is determined either to limit higher education or to persist in a fantasy about everyone having above average wages. It's impossible to imagine how we're ever going to get out of that, especially because we now got billions and billions of debt on the books, which you can't easily write off. So as Sam may have a magic.
Well, I was just gonna come in on this point. I mean, I wasn't involved in the development of tuition fees. Chris is more involved in that at the moment. I do support the principle of tuition fees. I think that that there is a reasonable argument. I think we've ended up with quite an unfortunate situation where students act as if they're going to have to pay all of it, and actually the state is paying 50% of it, and that is not an ideal place to be. I think there are some sort of broader questions about student financing, but I think my broader concern, and I'm sort of halfway between the sort of critics and on both sides here, is I do worry that a lot of people are going to higher education because they want the degree as a signaling factor for employment, and not because they actually want higher education. So my general view is that anyone who wants higher education should be able to access it, including a lot of people that currently can't access it, but that employers shouldn't require a degree for things that don't need a degree. And I'm not quite sure how you do that. I'm not sure politicians' ability to impact the labour market in that way is fairly limited. But I do, when you look at the HE assessment system, which is, in my opinion, ludicrous, 70% of people are getting the same grade. It does rather suggest that it's actually the degree itself, the bit of paper that is what really matters, and that is concerning to me.
But Sam, I understand your reservations, and I share some of them. But put it that way, you have also just enmeshed yourself in this, very monocular view of what higher education is for. That people are going into higher education without proper regard for the labor market. And
but that's the opposite of my view. My view is that the higher education shouldn't be about that, but that for too many people it is, because the reason they do it is for the signaling effect. And if that wasn't the reason for doing it, and it was only because that you actually wanted to do higher education, we'd be in a place where it's easier to make some of the arguments I think we actually agree on around its purpose.
I mean, it's quite a trying to disentangle. So Sam, what you would like is to disentangle the signal from the effect.
A degree, which you can't completely do that, nor would you want to do that, but I think it's overly entangled.
But Sam, I didn't mean to misinterpret you, but you did say that you thought employers required degrees where they weren't necessary. And my feeling about the way this works is that in fact employers generally expect degrees simply because all of the candidates that they would be considering for jobs have degrees. In my book I talk about this again in the 1960s, that employers started asking for degrees in subjects and for jobs which they had never previously considered, simply because those were where their candidates were. They were in degree cohorts rather than in school leaving cohorts. So, I suppose there's an interesting kind of cultural question here, which we don't sufficiently inquire into, which is, why do kids take degrees? Warwick did a really interesting project about 10 years ago called Future Track, where it asked people. It didn't just, rely on algorithms and fancy pants economic models, but it actually asked people why they were going to university, and then tracked them through university and then out the other end of the labor market, and asked them questions about their university experience. And it wasn't really clear that people were going largely with unrealistic expectations of the labor market outcomes. A lot of it, I think, was peer effects, but that's something different.
Right. That's an incredibly difficult and thorny problem. We are starting to see things like the growth of the higher apprenticeship market, and the things like the Ernst & Young sponsored degrees, where you sort of do them alongside training as an accountant. Yeah. And maybe we'll get a little bit of the disentangling that I think everyone wants, really. I wonder if I could actually just come back to Leora. I have to ask each of you. We're now heading into the final straits, but I wonder whether Ed Kidwallader has asked: is specialist organisation that really knows how to improve schools an accurate description of most maths? Just partly to bring us back to the question at hand. I was wondering about whether you thought going forwards what the right sort of level of accountability is, and how we sort of pick out this stuff, and whether we've got the infrastructure we need to make maths work. Are we examining them on the right thing?
This is going to sound like a bit of a technical point, but it is a live issue at the moment with the review of the ESFA. My firmly held belief is that we have not understood regulation within the English education system, and therefore it is imperfectly theorized. And therefore, in some cases, poorly enacted, not because the people who are doing it, who are excellent people, but because that we haven't actually understood it. So, if you look at where regulation sits, and I think I'll talk about just about the trust sector now, not about the maintain sector, in at least two places. In an independent body, the ESFA, it's half of the regulator, and the other half of the regulator is an RSCs. Now, what this means is that you've separated the regulation of finance and governance from standards and performance. I can tell you, as a former director of education, that is disastrous. Right. Why would we do that? So I think as we sort of move forward to complete the reform journey, I think it's absolutely essential that the state understands regulation, understands the best principles of risk-based regulation, and properly defines a regulatory entity underpinned by a proper regulatory framework. So have we got the accountability right? No, I don't think so. But I think there's an opportunity with the ESFA review to have a really good conversation about what this needs to be.
Okay, thank you very much. I wonder, we've got 2 minutes left. I was going to wonder if I could sweep back, if there are any final thoughts first to Sam, then I'll come back to Leora, then to Peter.
Thanks. I mean, I want to have a whole other hour to talk about MATs and local authorities, because I have a lot of views on that as well. And we haven't really got into that. I do think the local authority issue is a really important one, and there is a severe drift from the Department for Education over the last 6 years. Even though we started by saying policy isn't the most important thing, it does still matter, and we have had very little direction for the last 6 years. I'm very much hoping this new team that we now have is able to give us some direction and help us to see where the MAT kind of reforms are heading and are supposed to end up, because that's not clear to anyone at the moment.
Okay, Leora?
Sam, take you up on that conversation. It's something that I'm also really, really interested in, and I think you're right, it's a problem for us. Let's have another ArkTalks on that theme. But I think I'd like to conclude with the point that Sam made about opening up education to more young people, how we do that. It seems to me that is a fundamentally important question across a variety of age groups, not just within schools, but also in post-16 within our education system. And I think this panel's sort of opened up some of that, but there's a way to go.
And finally, Peter.
I just want to go back to a technical point, but I think it's an important one. Someone in the chat pointed out that BTECs are being steadily defunded, and it's clear from the government's point of view that they really want T-levels to replace a lot of the existing, what they call vocational qualifications, including BTECs, partly as a way, again, of saving money by diverting people out of higher education and back into apprenticeships and narrowly vocational tracks. And I think that would be a real disaster. And I very much appreciated what Sam said earlier about finding ways to make the 16-19 environment more inviting for more children and or for more teenagers. And from that point of view, restoring a two-track system seems to me the worst of all possible outcomes. And I've learned a lot from this discussion about the multiple ways in which we might make some of the divisions that still exist at 16 to 19 a little blurrier and enable more people to thrive while retaining some of what I consider to be the virtues of a specialization system. But I mean, I really would I think a lot of money needs to be dumped into the FE college sector, not in order to advance FE at the expense of HE, but to create as I said, an environment for 16 to 19-year-olds where people with lots of different abilities can all thrive together. It's really important.
Thanks, Peter. I think someone's about to put a link to a survey in the chat, which is a survey about this event. Please fill it in. It'd be very helpful to know your thoughts. I'd also like to note that on October the 20th, there's going to be another ArkTalks with Nick Gibb on the curriculum. Nick Gibb, as everyone on this call knows, was a schools minister from the Butler government until like last week, serving for 900 years continuously. It'll be very interesting as probably one of the most important schools ministers involved in schooling for over the last few decades. I'll be coming on to that. With that, let me thank our panelists, Leora Cruddas, Sam Freedman, and Peter Mandler. I found it there's so much to go at. And again, I would strongly recommend Peter's book, which is, as I said to him before we began, I found it very annoying as a reporter because a lot of the simplified canned narratives that we use as shorthand basically aren't true. And I can no longer in good conscience use them. But it is brilliant and remarkable, and there really isn't another book that explains the way that we got to where we are today. So thank you all, and I'll see you on October 20th.